Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for having us. So I'm Catherine McAlpine, my colleague Leah Van Poppel from the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, and we're going to talk to you today mainly about the NDIS. We're only going to talk a bit about our project, and we'll talk mainly about the NDIS, but then we're very happy to take questions and be directed by you in what information that you want. Just before I start, I thought I might just comment on Limbs for Kids. I think it's a wonderful initiative to have information, specific information and peer support. And the reason I know this is that I have a son with Down syndrome. I have 3 sons, and my middle son, they're all teenagers, and my middle son, Julian, has Down syndrome. And I know that I joined Down Syndrome Victoria from hospital while I was still in hospital when, they told me that they thought he might have Down syndrome. They were going to do the blood tests. And I thought I wanted information, but I had a good supportive family, and I thought, really not sure that I want to go, talk about the differences of engagement. Not really sure I want to go to that group, because they're going to be victims and they're going to feel sorry for themselves, and I really don't think I can deal with that. So for about 12 months, I just went on my merry way. And then I signed up, and there was a magazine, and I saw in a magazine a photo of all these little babies, about 12 months old, who lived in the same area as me, and I thought, Julian needs to meet them. I better go for him. So I trotted along for him, and lo and behold, I met a whole lot of people like me, and some of my best friends now come out of that group. And I think that shared experience of the journey certainly has really been an important place. We're from the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, so that's we work mainly in the disability advocacy space, so that's about trying to influence government for systemic change. And AFDO's members are, in general, disability-specific organisations. So, we have Blind Citizens Australia and Deaf Australia and Down Syndrome Australia and the National Council on Intellectual Disability and Brain Injury Australia. So all organisations like us. So I think that's, why you can see why Limbs to Life might have reached out to us to talk about things to do with disability. I'll just speak briefly about our project. Our project is the Disability Loop project, and that's a project that's been funded by the National Disability Insurance Agency. And the Disability Loop project is about the fact that there's no sort of central area that people with disability and families can access information on the NDIS. You've got a lot of service providers out there creating information, and it's not so much about the resources, because the resources, if you Google it, you might be able to find it if you're really good at the internet, but having a communication stream that is a loop. So it's a loop of information, providing information about the scheme and then receiving information. Now, the agency themselves, of course, are doing that work as well, but they're a big bureaucracy. They take a long time to do things. And so whilst they are redoing their website at the moment, for example, we're much smaller and more nimble and able to make some of those changes straight away so that people can access information during this really sort of difficult time of transition while the scheme's in trial phase and where people don't really know what's going to happen next. There needs to be a lot of communication at that point. So the team is Leah and I and our colleague Jean, who's, speaking of IT experts and web experts and design experts, that's Jean's our person there. We're about to launch a website, which we hope will be helpful to you. And the information we're about to talk to you about is about the NDIS. So within a couple of weeks, we'll email through to Fiona when it goes live, and we encourage you all to sign up to get the email newsletter and stay in the loop. So at this point, I'll hand over to Leah, who's actually going to talk about what is the NDIS, what's its purpose and what does it mean for people with disability in Australia.
You will have all seen that I'm a person with a disability. I have a white cane, so I'm vision impaired, but I'm actually deaf-blind. I have a cochlear implant as well. So as we're going, if you've got any comments or questions, or if I'm not speaking loudly enough, just indicate that to Catherine and she'll be able to let me know to, start using interpretive dance to communicate with you, which would be a bit scary for all of us. So I'm going to start by giving a bit of basic information about the NDIS. I apologise if some of you already know this, but what we're finding is that when we talk to people about the NDIS, some people have really good knowledge of it, and other people are still sort of going, I've heard of it. I kind of know it's meant to be good for people with disabilities, but I don't actually know what it means and what it does. So the NDIS was thought of because there are 3 specific problems with the way supports for people with disability work in Australia at the moment. Firstly, there's not enough money in the system. So if you need something, there are often long waiting lists. You might not be able to get exactly what you need and want to have a good life because money is scarce. It's very, very difficult for people to get support for that reason alone. Secondly, what kind of support you can get not only depends on whether you're lucky enough to access a bucket of money, but how you access that bucket of money depends on a whole lot of different rules. It might be about where you live, so some people are not able to move even from one local council area to another because the supports that they're able to get are really different. It might be about the way you acquire a disability, whether it happens when you're born, whether it happens through a car accident. It might be about your age or some other conditions. So a lot of it's a little bit arbitrary for people, and it's very difficult for people to navigate the system of disability supports that we have because of all those different rules. The third thing is that even when you manage to find a pot of money that exists and you meet the criteria for it, you then don't always have a lot of choice and control about what you're able to access. So at the moment, a lot of support is funded in bulk. So you might go to government and say, I want some respite or I want some aids and equipment, and that funding is handed to organisations that then dole it out, and maybe you get what you want, but maybe you don't. So the NDIS aims to address all three of these conditions. Firstly, it's putting much more money into the system. Secondly, it's making it national so that the rules across the country are going to be the same for everybody about whether you're in or whether you're out. And thirdly, and this is perhaps arguably one of the biggest changes, it's giving people choice and control. So the money doesn't go from government to maybe another organisation or maybe to a government agency. You come into the system, you go to the NDIS agency, the National Disability Insurance Agency, as an individual, and you say, we have these individual needs. And they sit down with you and work out what your individual needs are. The funding for those needs is tailored to you, and it stays with you or with your child. So it's a big shift in the way disability supports are done across Australia. At the moment, the NDIS is only available in trial sites, and Catherine's going to talk a little bit about where those trial sites are, and she's going to discuss the question of am I in or am I out?
So the critical question for most people who have a disability or a family member with a disability is, well, that all sounds great, but can I access that? So at the moment, the scheme's being developed, it's been rolled out as a trial. And so for very good reasons, and it's really interesting as we've been doing this project, the reasons really start to come home to you about the way the learn, build, that by doing things a little bit differently in different states and territories, or looking very closely at particular age cohorts, they're actually able to learn how to do it better. And so when they roll out the scheme in full, they'll be able to do that better. And of course, they can only roll out the scheme gradually because it's too big of a change to just go click your fingers and go, bang, there's a new national reform in. So at the moment, you can access the NDIS if you live in a trial site and if you meet the access requirements. So the trial sites at the moment, it's across the whole of the Australian Capital Territory. It's in the Hunter region of New South Wales. It's in the Barkly region of Northern Territory. It's in the whole state of South Australia, but only children from up to the age of 12. Tasmania is the whole state also, but that's children or young people aged 15 to 24. Victoria in the Barwon region, so in particular they are the cities of Greater Geelong, the Colac-Otway Shire, the Borough of Queenscliff and the Surf Coast Shire. So that's where you need to live in Victoria at the moment, and you have to have lived there since the beginning of the trial. So you can't move down there for the purposes of qualifying for the NDIS unless you have very good reason and there is an exceptional circumstances process to be able to do that. Your access requirements, therefore, possibly your age, well, for everyone your age, because the NDIS just applies to people up to the age of 65. So your age matters. In Victoria, it's from people from birth to 65, but as you heard in a couple of the other states, it's for specific age groups at this point in time. Depends on where you live. If you're in a trial site, depends on your citizenship. You must be an Australian citizenship. The bottom line is, if you're in a situation where you can access Medicare now, then you'll be able to access the NDIS. If you can't access Medicare, you'll need to look at the fine print of whether or not you can access the scheme. Then it depends on your disability, which will need to be permanent, and your support needs, and if you would benefit from early intervention. So the NDIS has a form called My Access Checker, which is a fairly complicated thing. You do it online and there are a whole lot of questions and you write down a whole lot of details. Just need to give you a bit of word of warning that when it comes to the point where you might qualify for the NDIS, when it starts to be rolled out more fully, that at the end of it you get a number. That does not mean you have put an application in. You must separately make an application. But the reason they give you a number is that all that information that you gave them, they can then access that as part of your application, so you don't have to tell that story twice. But the processes of checking it and getting a number and then ringing up and making an application are two separate things. So the thing is, it's going to be rolled out Australia-wide at the moment, we believe, if all the governments keep their promises, by 2019. What's not clear is how we go from where we are now to where we will be full scheme 0 to 65 Australia-wide. And those things are things that the Disability Reform Council, which is made up of the state and territory governments, or the state and territory disability ministers and the federal government, they're negotiating that at the moment, and we believe that we should know that by June, which is not very far away. Apart from that, this new website that will be launching in the next couple of weeks, we hope, also has some information about if you're not in a trial site, what you might do. But I'll talk about that a little bit later, because in the meantime, Leah's going to talk a little bit more about the NDIS itself, including some information about staff and the supports available.
Okay, so once you've gone through the assessment process that Catherine just talked about, looking at whether you meet the criteria, which are set out in a law, you then go through a planning process. This is done, funnily enough, by someone called a planner. Planners will sit down with you and work out what it is that your goals are, or your child's goals are for their life, for what it is they want to do to make their life good. And some of that might be about looking at, your longer term goals. Might be going, okay, well, in 5 years' time, we really want our child to be able to look at heading to high school successfully, and in the meantime, we know we're going to have to make all these preparatory steps to do that. It might be about something short term, like, okay, we want our child to be able to ride a bike. A planner will sit down with you, look at all of the goals that you have, and what kind of supports might be needed as part of your goals. They then draft up a plan, and that plan is submitted for approval. And that plan has often money attached to it to help you achieve those goals. So it might be that there's money in there if your child wants to learn to ride a bike, and you've thought about, okay, well, maybe they're going to need an adapted bike, maybe they're going to need a different prosthesis, maybe they're going to need some kind of physio or occupational therapy help to think about that. The plan would then articulate all of those things and articulate what kind of money would be attached for you to be able to get those things. The planner can also help you look into what kind of supports you might need. So there's a distinction in the National Disability Insurance Scheme between things that are disability specific and things about interacting with the rest of the world, which they call the mainstream, or sometimes it's talked about as interface supports. So sometimes, your child's goal might be about accessing Girl Guides, and she wants to go off and be able to do things with her peers in the local Girl Guides, but the Girl Guides are going, a child with a limb difference, we don't quite know what to do here. The planner might then talk to what's called a local area coordinator, or an LAC. And local area coordinators are the people who will go and do that interaction with mainstream supports. Like the Girl Guides, I might sit down with them and say, okay, well, what kind of adjustments do you need? Do you need to look at grants? Is it just about attitudes? And try and unpick things so that you can access other things in the community that you want to be able to access. In the trial sites, as Catherine mentioned, they're doing things a little bit differently in different places. So some places have very separate planners and local area coordinators, and some places are melding the roles a little bit. And there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So in regional and rural areas where you've got really dense kind of social networks where people know everybody else, and where there might be a shortage of staff to begin with, it could be a real advantage to have the same person doing the planning and doing the local area coordination. But if you've got a high caseload, you want maybe those two to be separate. So they're looking at how and where that's going to work really well. Now, I've talked a little bit about, in giving you some examples around planning, what it is that you can request and how that might look. So when you get in, a lot of people are sort of saying, okay, but what can I ask for? The NDIS talks about disability-specific supports, and it talks about supports that are reasonable and necessary. So disability-specific, sometimes, and they're still working out how some of these things work because you might have some really grey areas. Disability specific might be, for instance, that when your kid turns 16, you would normally, or some people, if their children are very lucky, might normally buy them a car. But if you've got a child with limb difference, you might be looking at some modifications for that car. So the NDIS wouldn't go and pay for the car because that's something everybody in the community is expected to pay for. But it would consider whether or not they needed to pay for the modifications to the car if you needed some modifications because of disability. So reasonable and necessary is a way of talking about whether a request is something that the person really needs and whether it's excessive. So obviously some people need respite because perhaps they're doing more for their child than would be expected of another child of the same age, and so it's reasonable for them to ask for that. All of those things can vary a little bit dependent on the circumstances and dependent on the specifics that a person needs. The kinds of things that are covered under the NDIS, generally speaking, so aids and equipment are covered. Some questions around whether things are covered by the health system and whether they're covered by the NDIS, but they're working those things through. Therapies, such as physiotherapy and occupational therapy and counselling. And things like community access, being able to have some help to get out there in the community, have some help to access employment is covered by the NDIS. So obviously it gets more specific, and if you can, it does get very specific to people's circumstances. Different people need different things. But that's the general gist of it, and we can talk through more of that in the questions if you like. I'm going to hand back to Catherine.
The last things that we just wanted to talk about is what you can do now to prepare for the NDIS on the assumptions that probably most of the people in the room are actually not not in the trial site at this point in time. And the things that people are talking about very much it's about imagining a good life. So there's a thing that lots of people with disability, particularly people who have been underfunded for a very long time, sort of so desperate to get the necessary supports going that that the actual, power of thinking, what do I actually want my life to be, gets forgotten. And so it's one of the things that the scheme is seeing, that people might come in for their first plan and get those really important supports in place and then think about a good life later. But that's the sort of thing that we can think about now, is like, what do we want our lives to look like, and then what supports along the way in the next 6 months or next 12 months. So I know planners have said that, people with, family members with very little children might come in. They say, what do you want? Well, I want them to go to school, and I want them to have a job, and I want them to be independent, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, what do you want in the next 6 months? And it's like, oh, I'm not sure. So it's doing a little bit of that investigation, having your long-term and your short-term goals. There's another project being funded, so for those of you who are sort of aware of what the agency's doing very specifically, there's a project called the DSO project, which is the Disability Support Organisation project, and that's about helping people get ready for the scheme through the mechanism of peer support groups. And one of the organisations that's been funded as a DSO organisation in Victoria is the Association for Children with a Disability. So I'd reasonably strongly encourage you to, as well as being a member of your disability-specific group, that you also possibly think about being a member of something like Association for Children with Disability, and they will talk about this project. And that project has just launched a website. It's still a website in development, but it's actually live now, and it's the peerconnect.org.au. So if you kept an eye out on that, there'll be ways of getting information via peer support. There are a number of organisations in Victoria who have them, but I think the most appropriate to you would be the Association for Children with Disability. As well as that, in New South Wales, the New South Wales government's actually done quite a lot of work in talking to people out of trial site areas in terms of the thought of things. So this is very much pitched at people with a disability, so possibly doesn't have so much of a child focus. But the My Choice Matters website also has a lot of materials about thinking about, it's what they call pre-planning, because the planning process is a formal process within the scheme, and doing your pre-planning thinking can be really helpful, and that's another website where that might be really helpful. The main thing, we keep just talking about the fact that having more choice, voice and control is a big change for many people. What I do think of parents of young children in particular, that we have higher expectations. It's not just enough for people to be healthy and happy anymore. We want full citizenship and full engagement. And what we're seeing is that there's a lot of adults who started off feeling that way and then have sort of been beaten down by the system a bit. So there's a lot of work done to sort of re-empower people to say, no, it's okay to take charge of your own life. And I think we're very blessed if we've got parents of young children that we can just start from that premise and move forward. And that just does remind us that things have actually improved, even though sometimes, you come across outdated attitudes, that really things have improved a lot and that this is a wonderful reform. We'd like to thank you very much for your interest today. We'd be interested in any evaluation that goes back to our discussions about whether or not you actually feel that the information we've given you on the NDIS is helpful. We're very happy for you to be as specific as you like so that we understand which bits were helpful and which weren't, so that we can tailor our talks as we go forward. And we'd be very happy to take any questions, time dependent, but we'll mill around for a little while afterwards if you'd like to ask any questions specifically. And there are our contact details if you'd like to contact us. Thanks very much for having us.